Yes.
What's your theory about what the collectors did or what their role was?
Oh God. Yeah, it depends. Well, So one possibility is that they're coordinating movements of animals. So the palace does have some breeding flocks. That is to say, the palace does have some of its own flocks that are designed to produce more sheep, right? So it's not purely the job of the private sphere in quotation marks, right? To produce these flocks, or to produce new sheep. They're mostly interested in these sheep for wool. They obviously also kill them occasionally to eat them. So that's, I guess, that's one way of thinking about it. They don't have to do the same thing at Pylos and Knossos, of course. So there's only 4 at Pylos. There's 25 at Knossos. At Knossos, they seem to have specific areas, like let's say geographical areas that they're interested in. At Pylos, that seems to be less the case. So Pylos seems to be a state that's a bit more centralized, or at least the Linear B administration is a bit more centralized compared to Knossos. Yeah, the short answer is I don't know. And people have argued about whether they should call them collectors. Some people say we should call them owners, and some people think we should call them, yeah, what else? There's a whole bunch of different suggestions that were made in the 90s. Yeah, I don't really know. I don't really know what they're doing. They're collecting. They're doing something with collection. That seems clear, right? Because that word agora is associated with them sometimes, not always. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we know for sure that the Wadaks and the Lava Gatas are different people?
100% for sure. I guess not. There's a text in which at Pylos in which that records land holdings, and there's a special plot of land at Temenos of the Wanaks, and there's a Temenos of the Lawagetas. Right. And if they were that means that they're separate offices. Mm-hmm. I suppose you could have one person holding both, right? Like you could have, I guess you shouldn't be able to, but theoretically you could have a situation in which, one person was both the president and the prime minister, right? Constitutionally that shouldn't work, right? But you could just say, screw it, I want to be president and prime minister, and you can't stop me, right? So so theoretically it could be possible, but because they're separate offices, I think the presumption is that separate individuals inhabit those offices, and that seems to be a pattern that yeah. So you have craftsmen that belong to the Wanaks, and you have craftsmen that belong to the Lawagetas, and it would be weird if the same person was both Wanaks and Lawagetas. Yeah.
These tablets.
Yeah.
You said they were all recycled.
Yeah, they seem to be temporary documents. They're not held for long periods of time. Yeah.
How would they do, and what would they do? Just throwing away the text and putting something on top? Or? Yeah,
so the texts are made of clay. The clay they're not fired. You can't really see it. But anyway, the clay is not fired intentionally. So if you wanted to recycle it, you would just throw it in a bucket of water and pulp it. The only reason we have these texts is because the palace burnt to the ground. So when the palace burnt to the ground, it fired the clay. And sometimes you can see well, these aren't good examples. Maybe I've got a better example. Sometimes you can see, well, you can't really see. But anyway, you can see that this part of the tablet is a different color from this part of the tablet. So the tablet, that's okay. The tablet, you take my word for it, the same tablet can be different colors and even different sizes. So the tablet can break, and then part of it is, burnt in one type of environment, and the other is burnt in another type of environment. So yeah, it's the destruction that preserves them for us. This is typical for archaeology, right? Horrible sudden deaths are terrible for people, but they're great for archaeologists, right? So Pompeii is kind of typical example, right? All these people died, and it's sad, and their dogs died, and that's sad. But it preserves things for archaeologists. So what archaeologists want is a sudden destruction, right? We don't want time for people to run away with their most treasured possessions because we want to know what they had. And then we don't want people to come back, right? We want the site to be abandoned and covered up, and then nothing happens until archaeologists come to excavate it. Yeah, these people have been dead for a long time, so we should feel bad, but maybe not as bad as we would otherwise feel. Yeah.
Can you talk about the archaeological evidence that does exist for the non-glacial population? I mean, is there really anything about the people out in the countryside that we can
Yeah, so this has been something that people have become increasingly interested in. You could imagine 100 years ago, what people were most interested in were palaces and fancy tombs. And then slowly over time, and this is something that actually started happening almost immediately once archaeology became professionalized. So basically, early 20th century, you started to get archaeologists saying, look, we need to know how regular people lived, right? So Carl Blegen, the guy who excavated Pylos, before the First World War, that's what he was doing. He was going around excavating at regular places and saying, we need to understand how regular folks lived. And that trend accelerated after the Second World War. So you had archaeologists doing archaeological surveys, so going out into the countryside and trying to understand settlement structure. And that's something that really started in the 50s, 60s, and then accelerated in the 70s and 80s. And then now, that's actually the first archaeological survey of Mycenae, the first sort of systematic archaeological survey of Mycenae, then excavated a provincial town. They thought it was an important provincial town. It turns out to have been not a super duper provincial town. So they excavated a town here called Nicoria. And then now archaeologists working in this area the second survey was done, and Michael Kosmopoulos, who's at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, is excavating a site called Iklina, which is just south of the Palace of Pylos. So again, one of these sort of secondary centers, so not the capital, but a town that was incorporated into the state. So yeah, so that's something that's accelerating. We need a lot more Mycenaean domestic architecture. We need to excavate a lot more houses, because that's the way we're really going to understand social structure, right? Is by excavating lots and lots of houses. And that's the one thing that's missing I would say it's the thing that's most missing from Mycenaean archaeology is not that houses haven't been excavated, but that we need a much larger sample size of Mycenaean houses from different parts of the Mycenaean world, and from different times during the Mycenaean civilization to try to paint a bigger picture. And we also have tombs, right? So tombs are something that have traditionally been a big part of Mycenaean archaeology, and we have tombs excavated from all levels of the social hierarchy. The thing there is we need to excavate the tombs according to modern standards of excavation. So a lot of, this is the case with archaeology. Most stuff was excavated early because those guys were moving a lot of dirt real fast. And so one of the projects I worked on as a graduate student was a project where we were excavating Mycenaean tombs very, very carefully, using a lot of scientific techniques to try to understand the individuals that were buried, and then also, things like how many times were the tombs opened? Can we find evidence of botanical remains, like flowers that were left at the graveside, and that kind of stuff. And that stuff, that material is now starting to be published. So we need more of that too, right? Yes?
You know, one thing that I find really difficult to understand is that if they had 800 names,
Yeah.
how those could be from different individuals. Because, okay, it seems to me like the most basic grade school concept. When I was in second grade, there were 4 Cindys in my class.
Yeah.
Okay? The teacher said Cindy 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah.
You know, so I would think that a scribe would have some indication if there were more than one of them.
Yes, this was something I was playing with. And so the question then is, if I'm a scribe, all these scribes have numbers. So let's say I'm hand 2. No, I don't like, well, let's say I'm hand 2. I don't like hand 2's handwriting. But let's say I'm hand 2. And hand 2 writes the list, he writes a lot of the names of the smiths, right? And then hand 2 has to write another document. Let's say a taxation document. And he has to say, you know, in this administrative district, the Smiths don't pay taxes, right? We have texts that say that. The Smiths do not pay. And this seems to be like, not that the Smiths are saying to the palace, screw you, we're not going to pay our taxes, but rather, this is, the palace has said, okay, because you guys are helping us out, or doing work for us, we're not going to charge you for taxes this year. Does hand 2 need to know who these guys are? And I suspect the answer is yes, he does, or somebody needs to know who these guys are. Because we have other texts that record individual payments of taxes. So like this guy paid this much, this guy paid this much, this guy paid this much. And you need to know who's not paying his taxes so that you can like, you know, send a couple of big strong guys out there to like, you know, kneecap them or whatever you do to people who don't pay their taxes, right? Presumably there has to be some kind of, I mean, if you're going to run the state, unless the Mycenaeans were horrible at running a state, there needs to be some kind of, you know, consequence to not paying your taxes. So I played with this idea too. I think that it is the case that the scribes need to know who these people are. That when the scribe writes a name, Hector, that he knows who he's talking about. And that needs to transfer over to multiple administrative domains. I think it's possible that some of these names in the tablets are nicknames. That's hard to prove. We know that in the ancient Near East, scribes use nicknames. In that case, we know it because sometimes we have administrative seals. The tablets are actually sealed by administrative seals, and those administrative seals provide the full name of the person involved in the transaction, and then we can see the scribe uses a different name for that same individual. So it's possible that in some cases we have nicknames. So for example, we have a bunch of names of people that are formally patronymics, and it's possible that those are nicknames because that guy has the same name. So you have a guy Hector over, you know, it's sort of like, I have a friend, and everyone calls him by his last name because he played on a football team where he wasn't the only Mike, right? So everyone called him by his last name. Or actually a shortened version of his last name. Everyone called him Pet. So some of these patronymics that we see as used as names could be kind of nicknames or ways of differentiating between people who have the same first name. Yeah. So I think that's right. I sort of make that argument that like, if these are different people, then what on earth are the scribes thinking? It must be super confusing because you can't hold like 200 names in your head, right? I mean, no, I've taught classes with 250 students in them, and you know, it's impossible to, yeah, if you've got multiple Cindys, like you were saying, to like know in every case. Okay, when I write Cindy on like line 24 of my spreadsheet, I mean this one, and on line 48, it's a different Cindy. I mean, there's no way to keep track of that stuff. So yeah, I think that's right. I think that's an argument in my favor. Yeah.
So now you come in as a revolutionary. Now you're going to say this. Okay, I give you credit because you're Greek, right?
My dad is, yeah.
Yes, so you have something. Okay. Now, the question is this. And this was a topic raised also, in that when we look at the past,
Yeah.
we are looking at the lens, through the lens of our present consciousness,
Sure.
influencing what we are seeing.
Yeah.
So, this idea that you propose, now, has anyone else ever thought that before? I mean, it seems so odd that these other folks had this rigid structure, and here you come with a more expanded view.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of in agreement with a whole bunch of other people who have argued similar things based on different kinds of evidence sets. So, you know, the idea that the palace isn't all powerful, the idea that the palace isn't controlling every single person and telling them what to do all the time, that's not really my idea, right? Those ideas were all developed, you know, mostly in the late 80s and 90s, and so I'm sort of riding that wave. In the ancient Near East, so partly the reason Finley was saying what he said about the Mycenaean world is because he was comparing, this was a part I was going to put in the talk, but I was going over and I cut it out. But Finley was comparing what was happening in Mycenaean Greece to what was happening in the ancient Near East, right? This whole deal here, this is exactly how we described ancient Near Eastern palaces. And actually, the recent work that's being done on the ancient Near East is focusing on private archives, so archives that are held in private houses. And we can see that actually something very similar to what I'm doing, what I'm proposing is also happening in contemporary societies in the ancient Near East. So, you know, what's now Syria and Jordan and Israel and Palestine, and then even further east in what's now Iraq. What you have are urban elites who are very well connected. They have their own private economic interests. They're also engaged in palatial activities, and they're go-betweens, right? So if I'm a palatial administrator and I need a bunch of leather because I'm in charge of a workshop that makes saddles, let's say. If I can't find the leather myself, I'm going to find a guy who can, right? And that guy is very often this sort of urban merchant who can get me leather, or can get me tin, or can get me gold. And these guys actually loan silver. Some of these guys even loan silver to palatial administrators. So they're loan sharks too, right? So you know, that's a different case, in part because our evidence there is much better. We have private archives. We don't have private archives in the Mycenaean world. So basically I have to theorize these contracts and exchanges purely on the basis of the palatial records. But even just on the basis of palatial records, we can see this. So for example, there are two texts in which the palace purchases alum from private individuals. And alum is not something that doesn't grow at all. It's not something that's found natively around Pylos. The closest place you could find it would be the island of Milos. So some of these individuals were probably merchants, right? The palace needed alum. The palace knew that these guys had alum, and it bought it from them. It bought it from them because that's easy, right? But that presupposes that you have private again in quotation marks, private merchants who are going out and trading for these things in the first place. Unless you think that the palace said to the guys, I need alum, go find it. I guess that's possible, right? But one of the guys that is getting alum for the palace is named Kyprios, the Cypriot, right? The Cypriot guy. So that doesn't mean that he actually was Cypriot. It could just mean he has connections to Cyprus, right? But either way, that works for me, right? Either way, that works for me. Yeah, so the ancient Near East, recent developments in the study of the texts helped me a lot. Also because the old model was using the Near East as a point of comparison, so I can play the same game, right? I can say, yeah, you want to use the Near East as a point of comparison? Fine, and let me show you how it works for me.
It's just astounding to me that there isn't this fluidness and this flexibility in understanding the human condition. That, you know, I keep wondering,
right,
because we're in the Nixonian area, everybody's got to think like Nixon. You know, it's like when researches are done. No, it's an incredible thing, and I really applaud you for that. That you're bringing us a variety of understandings.
Thanks. Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We might need to kind of wrap it up a little bit.
Sure.
But we do have a small some cookies and drinks out here. If anybody would like to continue the conversation, then we can do
Yeah.
that. So thank you very much, and look forward to